So we are here at DockerCon Europe. So before we start, can you quickly introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Peter Guagenti. I'm the CMO at Mesosphere. The role of a CMO in a software company is fundamentally different than in any other category. And I've worked as a marketer in consumer and in B2B. I've worked in technology and consumer packaged goods and financial services, et cetera. So I have a pretty broad perspective. And we have a really interesting role in marketing and technology. And it's one of education and guidance more than anything else, right? There used to be a place 20 years ago where as a marketer you would come up with a simple pithy message and buy a bunch of advertising and people would believe it. But that's not true anymore. What you actually see now is we have to position ourselves alongside the architectures and the thought leadership and the knowledge that our customers are interested in, prove our value, prove that we are who we say we are and that we deserve a seat at the table, and really connect with our potential buyers on a sort of more value-based level, which I actually really appreciate, right? Having a mixed background like I have with coming from both product and marketing, I really love that. I love that we have to really, instead of focusing on, here's a simple tagline, here, believe my bullshit, right? It's now more of a focus on, here's who we are, here's what our customers do, here's how we can support you, here's just insight into how we think and how we work and how it might apply to what you're thinking. And if we're somebody you want to do business with, then great, right? I really love that. And in this space, because the space is changing so quickly, we spend probably half our time as marketers simply on educating and informing about the market, about reference architectures, about, how people are thinking about the challenges in front of them. I don't think about talking about DCOS, I think about connected cars are really important, but nobody really knows how to build them. We serve 6 of the largest car makers in the world. So getting them to talk about how they're approaching this problem and how they're thinking about edge computing and computing in the car and data and moving data around and all of these things, that's really exciting stuff, right? So you're less of a marketer and more like someone like yourself, like a journalist or analyst trying to share a lot of this perspective. And then you earn your seat at the table if your content is credible and your platform is useful and you align with the way the customer wants to approach the problem.
And as you said, you have kind of wore different hats. So can you just quickly talk about your own involvement with the open source community as well as
Sure. I'm actually a long-time open source advocate. I've got quite a different background than many CMOs in that I came from a mix of product development and go-to-market. But I've been in open source for over 10 years. I built an open source services practice at a large digital agency called Razorfish when I was head of client services there. And then I've spent time at 3 open source companies now. Acquia, which is behind the Drupal open source project. Nginx, which is the world's most popular web server and application delivery controller, and now at Mesosphere, the container company.
I think we will be talking about something else, I remember my early days of journalism when you had to actually literally educate people about open source, the benefits of open source. Nowadays, almost everybody is using open source. So the new challenge that we see is that people are consuming open source, but they don't understand the open source development model. They don't understand, how to. So do you also see the same challenges because, with your customers that they are consuming open source, but they don't actually know that how to not create technical debt or how to become part of ecosystem?
That's actually a great question. Open source has evolved dramatically over the last 20 years and continues so over the last 10 years. I would argue 10 years ago, you were crazy if you were a Fortune 500 company and you were the CIO and said, I'm going to integrate open source everywhere. But now open source is the default. And I've worked in large state and national governments around the world. I've worked in the Fortune 500, and they all have adopted open source. But how they adopt open source and how successfully they adopt open source is different if you look company by company. And then the projects themselves are different. There are community-driven models. There are corporate-driven models. There are things in between, ecosystems like Kubernetes where you've got multiple companies contributing at scale. You've got a mix there, and companies don't always know how to make the best use of that. And finding a good enterprise partner to help them along the way, be it a services company or the backers of the projects that they're actively using, is really critical because it helps them understand how to use it, how to deploy it, and then more importantly, it does 2 things long term that really matter. One is it makes sure that they're making good decisions with that software and driving the roadmap forward, either by contributing or at least by being a voice in that. But more importantly, we take for granted that open source exists, but open source requires involvement, either contribution of code or cash, in order to keep those projects healthy. We actually now are at a point of where open source has been around long enough where we have seen early open source projects just die because they didn't actually have core maintainers being able to earn a salary. So that's something I really love in my role as a CMO. Every great technology company, I was told once, needs a hacker and a hustler. I was a good coder early on, but I wasn't great. I'm more of the hustler. I love being able to see businesses build around this, and then have that really be the heart of a healthy ecosystem. Where everyone's able to benefit from that code.
There is one thing more that I have noticed, and that is that a lot of these companies, who do consume, they don't have the culture. You mentioned two things, either the code or the cash. What role do you think culture plays here? Because if I met a lot of developers and their companies use open source, but they don't understand how open source works, so they are not even allowed to go to events like LinuxCon because they think it's wastage of money. They don't understand, that when you go to those events, you meet a lot of people who are trying to solve the same problem in a different way.
Yeah.
So how much do you think that third C, which is culture, play a role?
It matters, right? It matters. And actually, I would argue if you really look at digital transformation, if you really look at what we've been going through for the last 20 years, and you look at the companies that have done it best, right? The old stalwarts who have now reinvented themselves in a meaningful way and are continuing to evolve with the time, and are competing effectively. They had a culture where they could embrace and accept a lot of these things. If you look at hiring the great technology talent, what's the number one thing great technology talent expects? They want to work with the tools they want to use. They want to do it in a way that fits their pattern of behavior, their pattern of building these things. It's not the money, right? It's not the stock options. It's not the fancy work. It's is this a place I'm going to be able to go to work every day and do the kind of work I want to do in the way I want to do it? And culture, if you look inside of, I work with some of the largest banks. I work with some of the largest government entities. You look at the ones who've done it really well, they have a culture internally where they understand this stuff, right? And they understand what it means to not just use open source, but to be a part of an open source community. And sometimes you run into hurdles, like I work with a lot of large companies that don't either, are not comfortable contributing code back, or just simply don't feel they have the time to do it. But they replace that with other things, like the financial contribution to these projects, sending their people to these events, promoting the projects and actually going and telling their story. That's something we use at Mesosphere a lot. This space is changing, so we love having our largest customers just talking about what they're doing, talking about their architectures, which is as much of a contribution to the space as anything else. You don't have to just have reusable code, just being able to know, hey, you're going after an Internet of Things project. Here's how GE does it. You're going after you're going after machine learning. Here's how Uber does it, right? Those sorts of things are heavy contributions. That culture matters, right? That culture matters because it's not just a culture of open source and using open source. It's a culture of innovation. It's a culture of understanding change, right? And that's what open source is all about. Open source is about evolution as a group, right?
Now let's talk about Mesosphere and Mesos.
Sure.
I think that now you're also using Kubernetes, right?
Correct.
And if you look at Kubernetes, like almost everybody, Cloud Foundry, they're now using it for their own runtime,
Yep.
Docker. And the Mesosphere and Kubernetes, kind of, I don't know whether you look at competing with each other or complementing each other. So can you talk about, why Kubernetes and what's going to happen?
Yeah,
with
I think there was a fundamental misunderstanding of what DCOS was and what Kubernetes was, and it's because the space is so fragmented, and because the architectures are still evolving. But I think there was an expectation that it was Mesos versus Docker versus Kubernetes, right? And I don't think that was actually true, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that was true. And I was active in another open source project that was contributing code to all of these things. I was at Nginx, which tends to be used as the connective tissue for containers, regardless of what it is. And even I, from the outside, said, wait a minute, these are very different platforms. Why do we keep talking about it this way? And I think it was a lack of understanding, frankly. So DCOS at the end of the day is actually a distributed computing platform. The purpose of it is to take an entire data center or set of VMs or any other set of compute and turn it into a single addressable computer. So literally we can take an entire data center and say, here is all of the compute, all of the memory, all of the storage, what do you want to run on it? The core technology was Linux containers. That's what made it possible, similar to what Google did with Borg, right? And that was in fact, that was the inspiration for Mesos when Ben was at school, was seeing things like Borg and what Facebook had done and others that were all proprietary internal systems at the time. And on top of that, we built something called Marathon for container orchestration for microservices. We were actually the second largest contributor of code to Kubernetes for the first 3 versions, because we knew container orchestration would be commodity. There were already, even when we launched Marathon, there were already 7 or 8 container orchestrators in the wild, in open source on GitHub. Everything from Apple's Jarvis to the work that Facebook and others had done, to our Marathon, to other pieces that have been out there. So for us, the platform is not about one thing. Container orchestration is one piece of the puzzle. For us, the platform is a platform for running containerized, data-intensive modern applications. So we've built a platform that incorporates the security and the monitoring and the management and container orchestration, but also data services orchestration. So you can run things like Spark and Cassandra and Kafka, or things like TensorFlow. You can also run things like Jenkins or traditional Java apps that are not even in Docker containers, and just actually still orchestrate them across the same platform and share the same resources alongside containerized microservices. So as Kubernetes rose, we really look at it and said, okay, this is great. We now have a mature container orchestrator we can just incorporate. So starting about a year ago, actually, we hired talent back in who worked in the community. We hired a great individual who runs our product team who had actually incorporated Kubernetes at Nike. So real world enterprise users, frankly, because that's, if you want to be a great product company, you have to know what your customers want. And we started incorporating it. And today, now we have it as your option. So what we find is our beta customers who are running it already are running Kubernetes for containerized microservices. They're still using Marathon. A lot of them are heavy Marathon users. They were successful with it. They're using Marathon for things also, not just that, but also for things, like I said, around orchestrating Java applications and other non-Docker containerized applications as well. And it's a healthy platform at that. For us, we want to be an evergreen platform. As technology comes and goes, we want to still be that one platform you're going to continue to build and deploy and operate and scale your applications on top of. And we want to handle all of the heavy lifting, the best practices, build them natively in as code, so you don't have to worry about that. Just like we wouldn't tell you which data service to run. We have all of the major open source data services running on top of DCOS today. We wouldn't want to do the same with container orchestrators either. So you should be able to bring the one that matters to you. Now, your question around Kubernetes and others adopting it, I'm not surprised, right? Like I said, we knew a long time ago it was going to be commoditized, right? It was a matter of time before it became commoditized. And with Google putting so much energy behind it, and frankly, a lot of these other companies trying to reinvent themselves, there are a lot of platform as a service companies, private cloud 1.0 companies, folks who had sort of mediocre businesses that needed to reinvent themselves, and they've grabbed onto that community. Now the interesting thing is, okay, what do we have as standards around that? What do we have as consistency between those implementations? So if you write once, you can run it on any of those Kubernetes clusters. For us, we've really focused on pure, unadulterated Kubernetes, no fork, no modification, no nonsense. We think it's problematic that others are forking the project and building their own custom versions and things like that, because it's eliminating the value of having consistency with these platforms that you can write once, run anywhere, and handle it. Now, I think that'll sort itself out, and I think we'll end up with a handful of players that'll survive and thrive in the environment. But I would still challenge, what else, right? We can't have continued fragmentation. For us, we're focused on that evergreen platform, and we think others probably are as well, and that'll change the dialogue around all of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the forking, or creating technical debt yourself, is in long term it doesn't make any sense. But mostly I have seen that most of the these companies, they do try to stick to the upstream. That no forking, nothing, just stick to the upstream. And
the commercial versions are not, though, actually. If you look at most of the commercial versions, they are an earlier version that then has their own proprietary code added in and on top of.
Can you give some example? Like
that's our understanding of how Red Hat operates. Mm-hmm. That OpenShift is not pure Kubernetes. It is Kubernetes with their modifications, their alterations, their changes on top of it. And that works for them and it works for their customers running it, I guess. But if you're somebody who cares about having consistency, let's say you're somebody who's not 100% locked into the Red Hat stack, right? Let's say you're a company that wants to run that alongside other tools, or let's say you want to run on Google Cloud Platform and you want to run in your data center and you maybe want to run on a partner colo somewhere. If you've got different infrastructure, you've got a different setup between all of those, you're going to have different behaviors. That introduces risk, and that's the point of having platforms like this is consistency, right? Write once, run anywhere. And that's why we took the approach that we took, which is we made sure that Kubernetes pure, unadulterated runs on top of our stack, and that you can deploy it with one click and it's ready to go, and there will be no change. And frankly, even for us, so we run multiple versions. You can run different instances and different versions and all run them alongside each other. So if you want to do dev and test, you want to do those things, we want you to have that level of control.
If you look at Linux kernel itself, there is Red Hat kernel, Ubuntu kernel, SUSE kernel. They do, because depending on your customers or the market, so you do have to kind of do some patching at your own level. So the SUSE kernel is different from Ubuntu kernel, even if the same Linux kernel. So if Red Hat is doing certain things, or okay, let's just put it from other way. Okay, there are certain things that your customers need. That you have been in the market for a long time. And the upstream Kubernetes will not offer that. Mm-hmm. So what are your options there?
So the way we're approaching it is running it alongside and how you actually run it on our platform, right? So Kubernetes for us runs as a native workload on top of DCOS. So it runs just like you'd run Elastic or Spark or TensorFlow or Jenkins or anything else. So all of the security, the multi-tenancy, the high availability, all of that is built natively into our platform. So this way, anything that you want to have highly available, anything that you want to have secure, any of those things that you want to make possible, it's one set of behaviors regardless of what that workload is. And that's how we're handling it with Kubernetes. Because you're right, getting Kubernetes up and running in your data center is kind of a bear. Adding a lot of these capabilities is not straightforward. There was a great report issued by NewStack recently that was actually featuring what customers are saying about that and where they're getting held up. So it's important to do that, but we don't think you should fork and layer more into the existing code, because you're introducing risk at that point. You're introducing problems, and the behavior is going to be different. I don't think it's the same as the kernels. I don't think it's the same as the operating system, and I think the operating system is probably a false analogy. I think the more important thing here is really going for simplicity for the ops team and the developers to be able just to deploy anywhere they want and not worry about, okay, what's going to happen here when they do this, or even the patterns of behavior, right? If you want to use the operating system analogy, we're more as we start to fork and separate and things like this. Well, does it run on that version? Does it not run on that version? Do we want to have these problems anymore, right? Because that is an issue with Linux right now, right? Certain applications simply won't run on different versions, right? And I don't think the point of containers was not for us to get there again, right? The point of containers was to simplify that kind of drama that we've been dealing with for years.
That's why Red Hat or SUSE or Canonical, they are coming out with their own CAS platforms, whether it's Atomic or CAS for, I think, Ubuntu Core. So they are kind of moving in that direction either way. These are fully integrated proprietary stacks, though, right? And that doesn't make any sense to me, right? Mm-hmm. That doesn't make any sense, right? Taking off my open source business hat for a minute, taking my open source user hat, I built applications for most of my career before I ever started working in software. And that would frustrate the hell out of me, right? I don't want to sit there and say, okay, well, now I've got this one thing and I've got one pattern of behavior, and now I have to do it this way on this platform with this specific, set of expectations, and I'm locked in. Right, then I'm locked in at that point. That was not the point of containers, right? The point of containers was there should be, the ability to be able to deploy this stuff with ease anywhere we want, right? And the joy of something like the Kubernetes ecosystem thriving the way it has is that consistency, right? Is that consistency. Especially as a developer or operator, right? You're building a set of skills. You build a set of skills around Kubernetes, right? But then you go and you use someone else's flavor and it's a little bit different and it's got some strange behaviors and you can't really modify it. You can't change those behaviors. Is that what you're looking for? And some people will be totally okay with that. Personally, myself, I don't want that, right? Anything else you would like to touch upon? Because I got some core points that I wanted to talk to you about.
Sure. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about, you were at Summit. I don't know if you saw any of the customer stuff at Mesosphere, or you want to talk about the business at all, or, I think we're doing pretty well as a business right now, and I think that's, we're sort of the like forgotten cousin on the side, but I actually think based on some of the numbers we've seen, we might actually be the market leader right now by revenue and by customer count.